Episode 3. Internal. The building on South Hayes Street in Arlington doesn't have a sign. It has a street number, 4418, mounted in brushed aluminum above a glass door, and behind that glass door there is a lobby with a security desk and a man behind it who wears no uniform insignia of any kind. The building is 6 stories. The exterior is that particular shade of gray that appears on commercial construction projects when the architect has been instructed to have no opinions about color, material, or surface texture, and has complied without remainder. 3 rows of rectangular windows per floor, none of them capable of opening because they were never designed to. A parking structure adjacent, connected by an enclosed walkway at the 2nd floor level. The whole complex sits between a logistics company and an office park for a dental supply distributor, 2 businesses chosen, she suspected, for the same reason this one was chosen, which was that nobody driving past any of them would have any reason to slow down. Renn had driven from the dullest staging point with the heat off. The morning was flat and cold, the sky over I-66 the color of old newsprint, and the cold kept her alert in the specific way that physical discomfort keeps the mind from going somewhere less useful. She pulled into the parking structure at 8:51 a.m. level 2. She found a space near the elevator and sat for a moment with the engine running. Through the windshield, a concrete pillar, a yellow painted line, a rusted drain cover centered in the floor with a ring of dark water around the rim, a receipt on the floor of the adjacent empty space, too far away to read. The morning ambient sounds of a parking structure, the distant compression of a ventilation shaft somewhere above, the noise of a car 2 levels up pulling out of a space. She knew this building. She'd been here twice before, different reviews, different personnel. Both times she'd parked on level 2. Both times the review had taken less than 3 hours. The familiarity was not comforting exactly, but it was workable. Familiar was workable. The inside pocket of her jacket held her credentials, a folded incident form, and the photograph. She'd looked at Abara's file 3 times on the drive down, once at the staging point before she left, once at a rest stop on 66, once in the parking structure just now, and each time the file had told her the same thing. 26 years of perfect service, not one deviation, not one incomplete form, not one flag of any kind until 8 months ago when the compliance system had flagged an irregular pattern in his work queue, and someone had decided that warranted a review. The file didn't say what the irregular pattern was. The file said a compliance reviewer would investigate and report. She knew what the irregular pattern was. She'd been briefed before she left the staging point. She'd had 3 hours on I-66 to read the summary, which described 47 personnel files with missing contact designation fields, and a handwritten list, and a records administrator who had been adding names to the list for 8 months and hadn't told anyone. She turned the engine off, picked up her bag from the passenger seat, and got out. The enclosed walkway connecting the parking structure to the main building smelled like HVAC output and carpet cleaner, and something faintly sulfurous from the waterproofing compound, applied to the concrete walls, a smell she associated specifically with ICD facilities built out downward, because the compound was standard for below-grade construction ceiling, and it never fully volatilized. Her footsteps on the rubberized floor surface made almost no sound. At the far end of the walkway, a keypad, a green indicator light, and a door that released with a clean mechanical click when she held her credential card against the reader. The hallway inside was institutional white, the particular not quite white of paint that hasn't been refreshed in over a decade and has taken on the color of the air it's been absorbing. Fluorescent panels overhead, the older ballast kind, the kind that generate a hum at the low end of the audible range, just below the threshold where most people consciously notice it, right at the threshold where it accumulates if you're in the room long enough. A direction placard on the wall, floors 1-4, Public Records Administration. Below it, no placard, just a second keypad set into the wall in a slightly different gray than the wall around it, differentiated enough to find in a power outage, not so differentiated that anyone without a purpose would register it as being there at all. She scanned again, went down, 3 flights of stairs with a gray-painted metal railing and fluorescent strip lights at each landing. The air changed between the second and third landing, drier, cooler by several degrees, the faint metallic quality that she associated with server infrastructure behind the walls, with climate-controlled spaces where temperature fluctuation had been engineered out completely. At the bottom, a short corridor, sealed doors on both sides, each one without a window or a label, and at the far end a door marked Records Management, Level B, in the same clean institutional font as the placard upstairs. She pushed through it. Level B was a long room, 40 workstations approximately, in rows oriented to face the archive shelving along the near wall rather than arranged for any sense of natural movement through the space. The floor was institutional carpeting in a muddy blue that would have been chosen, when this floor was installed, to absorb visible wear and stay presentable for years without requiring replacement. Drop ceiling, 2x4 acoustic tiles. The overhead lights were LED panels that replicated fluorescent light quality, the color temperature, the diffusion pattern without the hum, and the absence of the hum produced its own quality of silence, a flatness that took some adjustment, like a room where the refrigerator has been unplugged, and you can't immediately identify what's different about the quality of the quiet. The physical archive shelving ran the full length of the near wall. Open metal frames, dark gray, holding labeled boxes in a classification system. She couldn't read from the door, but that was clearly a system. The boxes aligned with a precision that came from someone who checked alignment not because anyone required it, but because the person checking it required it of themselves. Along the far wall, server banks, floor to ceiling, behind mesh cooling panels that drew the metallic quality of the air through them in a constant low pull. 12 people at the rows. Nobody looked up when she came in. At the far end of the room, separated from the rows by enough space that it registered as deliberate, was a workstation positioned to face the room rather than a wall. Not a supervisory position. The sight lines were wrong for monitoring anyone's work, the angle too oblique, the distance too great. It wasn't an elevated position or a corner position. It was just turned inward. The positioning of someone who wanted the room visible while they worked, who wanted to see what they were working inside of and not be able to forget it. Solomon Abara was already watching her when she looked toward it. He stood when she crossed the floor. Not quickly, not the reflexive standing that reads as a flinch. He simply rose from his chair with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who has been doing deliberate things for a long time and doesn't see any advantage in doing them differently now. Late 50s, heavy set in the way that suggests a large frame that has always been large, the kind of build that settles into itself with age and becomes simply solid. He wore a blue shirt with a collar that had been ironed until it stood clean and flat. Sleeves rolled to the forearm in a fold that looked measured, that came from years of doing it the same way. His desk was nearly clear. A stack of folders aligned with the left edge. The ceramic coffee mug positioned with the unconscious precision of something returned to the same spot every morning. A keyboard, a monitor showing an administrative entry form, and beside his mug, a second mug unused that hadn't been there the last time the desk was photographed in the facility's routine documentation. MS. Renn. His voice was deliberate, not deep, not especially warm, just deliberate, each word placed with the full attention of someone who had learned a long time ago that carelessly placed words don't unplace. Mr. Abara, she set her bag on the chair beside his desk. I appreciate you making time this morning. The compliance review was scheduled for 9. He checked his monitor clock briefly. You're early. Traffic was light. He looked at her with the expression of a man measuring something he already knows the answer to. Not studying her, not performing the look of measurement, actually measuring something, doing a calculation that ran slightly below the level of expression. Then he gestured at the second mug. I made extra. She sat. He sat. He poured from a thermos black coffee, no ceremony, and set the mug in front of her at the right distance, not requiring her to reach for it. The thermos cap went back on immediately. He returned the thermos to its position parallel with the edge of the desk. Small automatic precision. the kind of orderliness that accumulates in a person who has been doing things the same way in the same space for a very long time and stopped noticing that they do them. "I've prepared the documentation you requested," he said. He opened the top folder and placed it in front of her. "Transfer logs, filing compliance reports, the full operational documentation package, everything through yesterday's close of business. I can walk you through the organization if that would help you locate specific records more quickly." "I'll read it first." He nodded. He folded his hands on the desk and didn't speak again. She noticed the rubber plant on the shelf above his keyboard, the overwatered one, leaves yellowing at the tips. Someone had put a small saucer under the pot at some point, and the saucer had a ring of mineral deposit around the inside edge, the kind of ring that takes months to build. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at the file. She noticed also that the rows of workstations behind Abara's desk were organized with a consistency that the rest of the building's layout didn't require. The chairs pushed in at matching angles when not in use. The paperwork on each desk was identifiable from where she sat as organized rather than accumulated. Not hospital clean, working clean. The clean of a space that processes a consistent volume of work and has a system for processing it. She'd been in administrative spaces that looked like Abara's department and spaces that didn't. And the difference was always a question of whether someone at the top of the department thought the system mattered or whether they thought the outputs mattered. Abara thought the system mattered. This was visible in every corner of Level B. He built the system and he ran the system and the system looked like him. She kept reading. The coffee was good. Significantly better than the sealed window, recycled air, drop ceiling quality of the building suggested was possible. She noticed this once, registered it in the category of Solomon Abara as a person who thought the coffee mattered enough to do something about it, and kept reading. At some point while she read, the ventilation system cycled and the air in the room shifted almost imperceptibly, a degree cooler, the metallic quality briefly more pronounced and then settling back. Nobody at the rows reacted. One person got up to get something from a filing cabinet along the wall, pulled a folder, went back to their workstation without looking in her direction. The work of the room continued. Keyboards, the low draw of the cooling infrastructure, the sounds of a space that hasn't had to accommodate an outsider in long enough that the outsider registers as incidental rather than central, a temporary condition to be waited out. She read. The documentation was exactly what his personnel file had prepared her for. 26 years of records administration without a single gap, a single deviation, a single misfiled form. But the file hadn't conveyed what looking at it actually felt like, which was different from looking at other thorough documentation she'd reviewed over 8 years of this work. Thorough documentation usually had the quality of compliance, someone doing what's required because the consequences of not doing it outweigh the effort of doing it. Someone performing correctness for an audience, whether that audience was present or anticipated. What she was reading had a different quality entirely. It was the work of someone who thought correctness was worthwhile independent of whether anyone ever checked. A system built to work, not to appear to work. Built to work even when nobody was looking. The internal logic of the filing system was visible within the first 10 pages, the way the record categories related to each other, the redundancy structure, the cross-referencing protocols between different parts of the archive. She could see the thinking, not just what the system did, but the reasons it was designed to do it that way, the problems it had been built to anticipate, the failure modes it had been built to prevent. She turned 20 pages, 30. Around page 32, she found the first entry in the edge case documentation, a subsection she hadn't seen in any other ICD administrative package, a log of instances where standard record categories had been insufficient and new categories had been created. Each entry listed the event type, the date the new category was created, the category definition, and a cross-reference to the first file processed under the new category. There were 43 entries. The most recent was 14 months ago. The oldest was in year 6. She looked at Abara. He was still sitting with his hands folded, watching the space between them rather than her face. "When did you start keeping this subsection?" she asked. "Year 6, he said, "when I rebuilt the categorization structure. I wanted a record of every time the standard categories were insufficient, every time something happened that required me to build a new way of recording it. He paused. It's the most useful part of the system in some ways. It's a record of everything that didn't fit the expected shape. She turned a few more pages and kept reading. This is thorough, she said. It's the job. Most people don't approach the job this way. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. Most people, he said, don't understand that the job is the same whether anyone checks it or not. He paused, picking his words with the precision he applied to everything. The correctness of a record doesn't depend on someone looking at the record. It depends on the record being accurate. If it's only accurate because someone might check, then it isn't really accurate, it's a performance of accuracy. The performance ends when the observer leaves. He looked at his desk. The performance never interested me. She turned another page and let that settle. His workstation had a framed photograph at its far left edge, turned so she couldn't see it. Just the back of the frame, dark wood, a small desk photograph size. The rubber plant on the shelf above the keyboard was overwatered, the leaves yellowing at the tips in the specific way of a plant that's alive but not quite right. A plant that has been looked after but not quite correctly. Its pot was newer than the plant. She could see the ghost of the previous pot's ring on the shelf under the current one. The plant had been here long enough that the pot needed changing. A coffee ring on the desk surface, old, scrubbed but not removed. The record a surface keeps when the same person has been at the same desk every morning for 26 years. You came to the program from DIA, she said. Yes, reached for his mug. Analyst. Pattern recognition in data sets not designed to produce patterns. That was the capability they wanted. I worked in field support for the first 4 years. Logistics, scheduling, material tracking, the infrastructure that makes field operations possible without the field operations appearing in any documentation chain that could surface anywhere. Then I moved into administration. He held the mug without drinking. I moved by choice. Analysis has a decision point at the end that I found uncomfortable over time. You identify the pattern, you establish what the pattern means, and then someone decides whether the information gets acted on or filed or passed up or. He stopped. A deliberate stopping. That gap between what the data indicates and what happens because of what the data indicates, I found it difficult to work in that gap. Administration doesn't have it. The form got filed correctly or it didn't. The record matches the event or it doesn't. When it doesn't, I correct it. The function is clear. And when you can't correct it, you document it accurately, he said. Whatever the discrepancy is, you make sure the documentation is complete and correctly filed and in the system. The record has to reflect what's real, even when what's real isn't something the standard record format was designed to accommodate. She put the documentation folder to one side, drank her coffee. Behind the server wall, cooling infrastructure shifted cycle. The air moved once slightly and stopped. I'd like to see the current workload, she said. The active queue. He reached for the second folder. His hand paused above it. Before you look at it, he said. He kept his eyes on the folders, not on her. I want to say something precisely. The current workload includes files I've been processing outside my assigned queue for the past 8 months. I pulled them on my own initiative, on my own authorization, without being directed to do so. The pattern is in the standard records I was assigned to process, but the files themselves I pulled independently. That was my decision and I want it clearly on record. What pattern? He reached past the second folder to a third one, lower in the stack, and opened it and turned it so she could read it. The list was handwritten on 3 sheets of standard paper, front and back, 2 columns per page. Small, precise handwriting, each letter fully formed, each number unambiguous, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone trained in it or from someone who trained themselves, someone for whom precision extended to the physical act of making a record as naturally as it extended to everything else. 47 names. Beside each name, a date. That was the whole list. No annotations, no categories, nothing except the names and the dates. The dates were in a consistent format. Month spelled out, day, 4-digit year. No abbreviations. The care of someone who didn't want any ambiguity about whether October and August might be confused, whether a 2 could be read as a 7. The care of someone making a record that he intended to be unambiguous when someone else eventually read it. She read it. The coffee mug went down without sound, and she'd read at the same pace she'd read the documentation. Column to column, page to page, her left hand flat on the desk, her jaw relaxed, her face doing nothing it wasn't always doing. She read every name. She knew 31 of them directly. Knew them in the compressed specific way of institutional memory built across 8 years of the same kind of work. The details of individual cases blur together, but the fact of each case doesn't. 15 she had closed personally. She had been present. Her credential code on the incident forms, her signature on the transfer records that would have been processed in a room like this one, possibly through a system like this one, by a person very much like the one sitting across from her now. The other 16 she knew from briefings, from file reviews, from the accumulated proximity of working inside a function long enough that the function stops requiring a door to enter. The remaining 16 she didn't know by name. She recognized several of the dates. The dates were sufficient. She turned to the second page. The third, she finished the list. She looked up. Abara had been watching her the whole time. Not her face, he'd been watching her eyes, the pace of her reading, whether her rhythm changed at any point, whether any name on the list registered differently from the others in any observable way. Her face hadn't changed. His shoulders settled, almost imperceptibly. He exhaled once quietly, the breath of someone whose body has received a confirmation it was already carrying and has registered the confirmation. He'd been sitting in that particular stillness since she'd come through the door. She noticed it in the first 30 seconds, before she sat down, before he gestured at the second mug. The stillness of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing, and whose waiting has become so practiced that it stopped being waiting and become just another version of work. He'd been here every morning for 8 months. The flag queue generating, the flags processed, the list updated, the next morning arriving. He'd sat at this desk with the list in the third folder and done his job and waited, and the waiting had taken on the quality of everything else he'd spent 26 years doing, which was thorough and complete and carried out the same way whether anyone was watching or not. "You recognize them," he said. "Walk me through the pattern," she said. He was quiet. Then he began. "Voluntary reassignment is the standard record category for personnel processed out of the program," he said. "The notation protocol includes a contact designation, forwarding instructions, or a notation of no forwarding requested, or a next of kin reference in cases where the outgoing personnel wants no forwarding record at all. The third option is uncommon, but it exists in the protocol. Every voluntary reassignment I've processed in 26 years has had one of those 3 notations. The absence of the designation field produces an automatic flag in my queue. I built that flag in year 3 because I noticed the field being skipped occasionally under time pressure, and I wanted the error to surface automatically rather than wait for the quarterly review to catch it." She waited. 47 records, he said. "None of them have a contact designation. Not one." He looked at the list on the desk between them. "In 26 years, I've processed 11,412 personnel actions, 318 voluntary reassignments. The contact designation was absent from 2 of them. Both times it was a data entry error I found within 72 hours and corrected. Both times exactly what it looked like, someone moving fast who skipped the field." He paused. "The 47 flagged in my queue 8 months ago during the quarterly review. I pulled them expecting the same thing, a batch entry error. I pulled the first file. The original record was intact and correct, but a recent modification had removed the designation field data that had previously been entered. Not left the field blank, it had removed the data that had been there and replaced it with nothing." He stopped. She waited. "I pulled the second one," he said. "Same structure. Original record correct. Recent modification removing the designation. Then the third." He looked at the list. The third was a name I recognized from a briefing summary I'd processed 2 years prior. That person had been logged as transferred to a facility in New Mexico. The original record had been complete and correct when I processed it. The modification timestamp was 8 weeks before I pulled it." He paused. "At that point I understood what I was looking at, not what it meant outside the record. I want to be precise about that distinction. I understood what the records were, accurate documentation of a modification made deliberately, applied to 47 files over a period of 3 years. The dates cluster," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the steadiness of his expression, the small adjustment of an estimate already formed. 3 periods, he said. 18 months around the 2019 operations, the 2021 review period, the 30 months following the interpretation work in 2022. He was quiet for a moment. I've been in this building long enough to know its institutional rhythm, when it's running at normal tempo and when something is driving it faster. Those 3 periods were not normal tempo. He paused. I'm not claiming to know what the dates mean. I'm saying they're not randomly distributed. You didn't file a report, she said. No. You didn't escalate. You didn't contact anyone outside the program. No. She looked at him. Why leave it out? He was quiet for a long moment. I spent 8 months not telling anyone, he said. I didn't go to my supervisor. I didn't flag it through any channel except the internal queue, which I then processed without correcting because there was nothing to correct. The records accurately documented an absence that had been placed in them deliberately. I kept adding names because the flag kept generating. He looked at his hands. What I found was unbearable in a precise way. I've processed the paperwork that comes after field operations for 26 years. I know what the program does. That wasn't the problem. Then what was it? A precision problem, he said. The system produced an output the system couldn't account for within its own parameters. The record doesn't match, and I couldn't make it match, because making it match would mean filing incorrect designations, and I've never filed an incorrect designation in 26 years. I couldn't override the flag and I couldn't file inaccurate data. He paused. Every morning I came in and the queue had new flags and I processed the flags without correcting them because the records were accurate. The records were accurately documenting an absence. I couldn't correct an accurate record. He looked up at her. The list kept growing. You could have corrected the designations. No. He said it with an absolute flatness that wasn't emphasis, just fact. I could have entered data in the designation field. I could have typed something into the field and the flag would have cleared and the record would have closed. But the data I entered would have been fabricated. It wouldn't have matched any real forwarding instruction or real next of kin reference because there weren't any. There was nothing to enter. Entering something would have made the field look complete when it wasn't. He looked at his hands. I've never entered fabricated data in a record. I wasn't going to start with 47. And so you left it out. He looked at her directly. I left it out because I needed there to be a moment where someone read those names with me watching them read them, he said. Not filed a report, not escalated, not passed it anywhere. Just read the names and understood what they were with me in the room to see that they understood. He paused. I've been thinking about why I needed that for 8 months. I still don't have a complete answer. He looked at the list folder. I think it has to do with the record. The record needs a witness. The thing that gets documented needs someone to receive the documentation. A file in a box on a shelf is a record technically, but a record nobody reads is. He paused. It's something, but it's not what a record is supposed to be. He stopped. I needed the record to exist for someone, for one person at least, even if that person was. He stopped again. She waited, even if that person was the person who would make sure it stopped existing, he said. She held his gaze. The room held its sounds around them. You knew why I was coming, she said. I processed the compliance review orders, he said. I read the order when it came through. I know what a compliance review is and what kind of irregularity generates one. His voice was level, completely level, the voice of a man reporting information rather than managing its emotional weight. I've been here long enough to understand how the program responds to patterns. Someone starts noticing things they shouldn't be noticing. A review gets scheduled. A reviewer comes. He looked at his desk. I knew you were coming for 8 months. I kept adding names. I left the list out. I wanted to choose to show it to you rather than have it found. What did you expect? This, he said. This exact conversation. I've had 8 months to think about what it would look like. He paused. I expected you to read the list and not react. I expected to understand from the way you didn't react exactly what the list was and exactly what I was now. I was right about both of those things. She looked at him. I've been doing this work for 26 years, he said. I understand what it is. I've never had any illusions about what it is. The program is what it is, and the people who do this work are what they are, and I'm one of those people. I process the records that make the program function. I've always known that. He looked at the list folder. The thing I didn't account for was what it would feel like when my own system found this particular record. The system I built, that's all. I didn't anticipate what it would feel like to be the person whose work found this. The room was quiet around them, keyboards in the rows behind her, the low cooling draw, a metallic knock from somewhere in the building's infrastructure once, and then nothing. I'd like to see the filing system architecture, she said. The redundant categorization structure from the terminal if you'd walk me through it. He held her gaze for 4 seconds, 5. Then he turned to his monitor. Of course, he said. He walked her through it for 41 minutes. The core architecture came first, the logic of how the record categories related to each other, why the relationships had been built the way they'd been built, what failure modes they'd been designed to prevent. He pulled up a category tree on the monitor and turned the screen slightly so she could see it more clearly. The fundamental problem with most record systems, he said, is that they are designed around expected event types. The categories exist for the normal cases. When something outside the normal cases occurs, it either gets forced into a category that doesn't quite fit, or it falls into the gap between categories and doesn't get recorded with the specificity it needs. He pointed at the category tree. I rebuilt the categorization structure in year 6. Every major event type has both a standard category and an edge case category. If the normal category doesn't fit, the edge case category records the fact of the abnormality and flags it for manual review. The gap doesn't exist. She looked at the tree. It was more extensive than the standard ICD administrative architecture she'd seen in other facilities, subcategories and sub-subcategories, each one specific, each one apparently named and defined by someone who had thought carefully about what the category needed to capture and what it needed to distinguish itself from. Who maintains the definitions? She asked. I do. When a new event type surfaces that doesn't fit the existing structure, I add a category. The last edition was 14 months ago, a category for personnel transfers requiring dual clearance verification. After 2 cases in the same quarter that required a process we didn't have a record structure for. He pointed at a subcategory in the tree. 43 additions since the year 6 redesign. He looked at the tree for a moment. The system is a record of everything unusual that's happened in 22 years. Everything that didn't fit the expected categories. Every time something happened that I had to build a new way of recording. She asked about the redundancy structure. He pulled up the cross-reference protocols. He spent 10 minutes on them, walking through the logic without shortcutting it, explaining why each redundancy had been built the way it had been built, what it was designed to catch, what would have slipped through without it. His cadence while explaining the system was different from his cadence in conversation. In conversation, he was careful and weighted, the pauses deliberate, each sentence placed with full attention to what it would do when it landed. In the system walkthrough, he moved differently, not rushing, just faster in the way a person moves when they know the material completely and don't have to negotiate with it. The pauses were still there, but they were structural rather than careful. The pauses of someone navigating a space they know well and stopping only at the points that actually warrant stopping. He built this. He knew it the way you know something you built and have been maintaining for 2 decades, which is differently from any other kind of knowing. She asked a question about the modification log format, and he answered it precisely, and then continued without prompting into the error correction architecture, which was structural rather than procedural, embedded in the relationships between fields so that a discrepancy in one area of a record automatically produced a flag in a different area, no human step in the loop. At some point during the walkthrough, one of the people in the rows behind her got up and brought a folder to a colleague 3 stations down, and they exchanged a brief word, and the person went back to their workstation. Abara didn't look up. He was explaining the archive correlation architecture, the logic of the verification sheets, and he kept going. The room continued around the 2 of them at the pace of a room that has been running at its own pace for a long time and isn't going to change it because a compliance reviewer is present. That normalcy was its own kind of information, and she noted it without breaking the walkthrough. He pulled up the current flag queue. A list of items, each with a status and a date. Current items, all of them recent, all of them low severity. Data entry inconsistencies, minor format deviations, the routine noise of a high-volume system catching its own errors. The 47 generated in the queue like everything else, he said. The first 2 looked like data entry errors. I corrected them and moved on. He looked at the queue. The third one, I pulled the modification history. Because you recognize the name. Because I recognized the name, he said. And when the name was familiar and the modification timestamp was 8 weeks old, those 2 things together told me something the name alone hadn't told me. He paused. The modification had been made by a credentialed user, the appropriate clearance level for the modification. The system accepted it. In the technical sense of what the system accepts, it was authorized. He looked at his hands on the keyboard. The system accepted all 47. My quarterly review caught them anyway, because the quarterly review was built to catch exactly this, and it doesn't care whether a modification was technically authorized. It cares whether the record is complete. He moved to the physical archive correlation protocol. The shelves she'd seen when she came in, the labeled boxes, were not simply storage. They were a verification layer, a physical record that cross-referenced the digital system, so that neither could be modified independently without the discrepancy surfacing in the other within 48 hours of the quarterly review running. Every file in the digital system has a corresponding printed verification sheet in the physical archive, he said. The verification sheet records the state of the file at the time of its last confirmed complete status. When the quarterly review runs, it compares the current digital record against the printed sheet. He looked toward the archive shelving visible at the far end of the room. If someone modifies the digital record, the verification sheet still shows the original state. The discrepancy surfaces. And if they modified both, she said, they'd need physical access to level B and knowledge of the correlation system. He was quiet for a moment. There are 847 boxes on those shelves. The organization system isn't documented externally. I designed it. I'm the only person who knows it completely. He paused. The 47 were modified digitally. The physical verification sheets weren't touched. She looked at the archive shelves through the far end of the room. Which means, she said, which means either whoever did this doesn't know about the physical archive correlation, he said, or they knew about it and assessed the quarterly review risk as acceptable. He stopped. Or they knew about the quarterly review and they knew someone would find it. Which is it? He looked at his monitor. He was quiet for long enough that the question settled into the room and became something other than a question, more like the space where an answer would have been if the answer were different. I've thought about that for 8 months, he said. I don't know. She looked at the archive shelves. The labeled boxes, the consistent alignment, the system that existed completely only in Abara's head. The machine functions, she said, because people like you make it function. He looked at her. Yes. And then someone builds 47 files with modified records and puts them in the system. And then I find them, he said, because I built the system that finds them. He looked at the archive shelves. I've been trying to work out whether that's ironic. For 8 months, I've been trying to decide whether it's ironic or whether it's just what it is. The system working correctly. He paused. The system found what the system was built to find. The fact that the thing it found was inside the system doesn't change that. It just means the system found something closer to home than the system was designed to imagine finding. She didn't say anything. I built a system precise enough to document the thing I wasn't supposed to document. He said, I did that. My work, my design, my implementation. 26 years of building something that works. And the thing it found in cycle 66 was this. He looked at the list folder on the desk. I can't separate those facts. The list is mine, not because I made what it documents, but because my system is what documented it. She looked at the archive shelves for a moment and then looked back at him. The most recent modification, she said, 6 weeks ago. Yes, the quarterly review runs on what cycle? 90 days. He looked at the calendar on the screen. The most recent cycle completed 12 days ago. The modification was made 42 days before the review ran. He paused. It was found in the review. She looked at the calendar. 67 cycles logged, annotated, timestamped. 22 years of quarterly reviews, not one missed, going back to a point when Solomon Abara had been in his mid-30s and had just rebuilt the categorization structure in year 6 and had decided that the quarterly review needed to cross-reference the physical archive. "The next review is in 78 days, she said. He didn't answer. He looked at the screen for a moment and then looked at his hands and then looked at the screen again, and she watched him sit with something that she didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. She reached for her bag. She took out the folders, documentation package, current workload, the list, and placed them in the bag one by one, at a consistent, unhurried pace. A printed compliance review form came from the inside pocket of her jacket next. She filled in the date and reference number and her credential code in the 3 designated fields and placed it on his desk in the cleared space where the folders had been. "Your copy of the review record," she said, looked at the form. He didn't pick it up. His hands were flat on the desk on both sides of it open. "Mr. Abara," he looked up. "The system is functioning correctly. No particular inflection, just a statement made clearly in a level voice. Your documentation is thorough. The review is complete." He held her gaze, and she watched what moved through his expression, which was not relief and not the kind of collapse that comes with the end of something feared and anticipated. Not resignation. What moved through his expression was recognition. The clear, almost technical recognition of a precise thing confirming its own prediction. He had known what this conversation would look like. He had described it to her exactly 8 months before it happened, and the conversation had looked exactly the way he said it would look. He looked like a man watching something he built do what he built it to do. "I know," he said. She stood. The bag went over her shoulder. She picked up her coffee mug, the one he'd poured for her when she first sat down, and carried it the 3 steps to his workstation and set it down near the edge of his desk, beside the unused second mug he'd prepared that morning, so that the 2 mugs sat there together in the cleared workspace. No thought to it. She did it. Her right hand went to the inside pocket of her jacket. The photograph. The Burgundy family, the woman with the genuine smile, the teenage girl making a face at the camera, the man standing slightly apart with his hands at his sides. She'd taken it from Brennan's apartment in Detroit 8 weeks ago, during the close on Brennan, from a shelf near the door where it had been sitting face forward in the way of a photograph someone looked at frequently. She hadn't examined why she took it, why she'd kept it either. She took it out now and set it on Abara's desk, in the cleared space beside the mug, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes on the far wall, on the archive shelving, on nothing. He was looking at his monitor, at the compliance form, at his hands. He didn't see the photograph on his desk. She put it back in her pocket. "Thank you for your time," she said. He said something very quietly. She couldn't catch it. She was already turning. She walked through level B, past the rows, past the keyboards, through the flat LED light and the cooling drawer and the archive shelves with their labeled boxes aligned to the precision of someone who checks alignment because they require it of themselves. Through the door marked Records Management, level B, up the 3 flights of stairs, through the lobby, through the walkway, out into the parking structure. Level 2, yellow line, concrete pillar, drain cover. She put the bag in the trunk. She stood there for a moment with one hand on the closed lid, not thinking about anything specific, and then she stepped back. The parking structure smelled the same as it had at 8:51 a.m. HVAC output, exhaust residue, the specific quality of enclosed concrete that has never been worn. The receipt was still on the floor of the adjacent empty space, still too far away to read. Whatever it had said when she drove in it still said now. The building was behind her. She knew that without looking. The building on South Hayes Street, still running, the records still being processed, the forms still being filed. The error correction system Solomon Abara had spent years building still flagging what it was built to flag, still running at the pace of a room that doesn't change its pace for compliance reviews or anything else. Down on level B at the far end of the long room with the muddy blue carpeting, a workstation positioned to face inward, and on that workstation a ceramic mug, and beside it an unused second mug and a compliance review form in the cleared space where the folders had been. The monitor showing 67 consecutive quarterly cycles. The framed photograph at the far edge of the desk turned toward him. His coffee was still warm. Probably. She got in the car. The engine turned over, the heat came on automatically, and she sat with her hands on the wheel for a moment before she put it in reverse and backed out of the space. The ramp from level 2 fed onto 15th Street. She turned north. The sky had dropped while she was inside. The front that had been sitting offshore since Tuesday had finally moved, and the first drops hit the windshield before she reached the I-66 merge. She turned the wipers on. Standard interval. The road surface broke the oncoming headlights into reds and whites and the fractured orange of construction pylons along the shoulder. She keyed the channel designation code. Abara review complete. Documentation pulled. Filing system assessment complete. No compliance issues identified. A pause, the specific quality of an encrypted line, not silence exactly, more like the sound of distance made audible. Understood. Mark it closed. Proceed to staging. Copy. She ended the channel. She drove north at 61 miles per hour through the rain, wipers sweeping, the bag in the trunk, the list in the bag. 47 names in 2 columns in small, precise handwriting that didn't vary from the first page to the last. The handwriting of a man who thought precision was worthwhile whether anyone was watching or not, who had applied that principle to his work for 26 years, and who had then applied it for 8 months to the project of documenting the thing that had been modified to disappear. She thought about the category tree on his monitor. 43 edge case categories, the most recent 14 months old. Every one of them a record of something that hadn't fit the standard shape, something unusual enough that Abara had needed to build a new way of recording it. She thought about what the 44th category would have been if he'd been the kind of person who built categories for himself. He hadn't built that category. He built a list instead. The flag kept generating. He kept processing the flags without correcting them because the records were accurate and he didn't file incorrect records. He kept adding names to the list in handwriting that didn't vary because his handwriting never varied. He left the list out on his desk on the morning the compliance review came through because he'd spent 8 months deciding to show it rather than have it found, and when the choice arrived he'd already made it. She hadn't examined why she'd set the photograph down for 2 seconds and then picked it back up. She wasn't going to examine it now. Past Fairfax Drive the rain came back harder, the front having stalled before moving fully through, and she turned the wipers to interval 2 and held 61. The highway opened up past Rosslyn and she kept her speed. She thought about what Abara had said about working in the gap between what data indicates and what happens because of what data indicates. How he'd found it difficult. How he'd moved to administration to get away from it. How the gap had followed him. 22 years of quarterly cycles, and in cycle 66, the gap arrived inside his own system and produced 47 names in his flag queue that the system correctly identified, and that he correctly processed, and that he correctly documented. And all of that correctness had led precisely here, to a bag in the trunk of a car driving north on I-66, to a list that would be processed by someone else before his next quarterly review ran, to the 78th day from now when the review would run and find nothing and flag nothing, and the cycle would log itself as complete. She drove north at 61 miles per hour and didn't think about what he'd said when she was leaving. Couldn't catch it. She was already turning. She'd read 47 names at the same pace, and her face hadn't changed, and he'd watched her face not change, and he'd understood from that exactly what the list was, and exactly what he was now. He told her that was what he expected, that he was right about it. She turned the wipers back to standard interval when the rain eased past the Spout Run merge. The road surface was still wet, but the pressure had dropped. The photograph was in her pocket. She'd taken it from Brennan's apartment 8 weeks ago and she'd kept it, and she'd set it on Abara's desk for 2 seconds while he looked at his monitor, and then she'd picked it back up. Nothing was supposed to happen. She just set it down and then picked it back up, and nobody had seen it, and it hadn't mattered, and she wasn't going to examine why she'd done it. The briefing at the staging point had described Abara as a records administrator who had noticed an irregular pattern and begun compiling documentation without reporting it or escalating it or taking any action at all. The briefing had used the phrase irregular pattern. That was the language. Irregular pattern. 47 names, front and back, 3 sheets of paper, in handwriting that didn't vary. The staging apartment was 40 minutes north of where she was. She'd be there before noon. She'd file the review record and log the documentation and pass the bag up through the channel, and by tomorrow morning the list would be processed by someone else, and the flag that had generated in Abara's queue in cycle 66 would not generate in cycle 67. The system would go on functioning correctly. Behind her, the building on South Hayes Street continued to do what it was built to do. The records kept being processed. The forms kept being filed. Whoever ran the next quarterly review in 78 days would find whatever was there to find. Whoever that was, they would sit at a workstation on level B and pull the review queue and start at the beginning and work through it. And the system would surface what the system was built to surface. And that person would process what they found according to the function they were there to perform. The same way Abara had processed it. The same way Renn was processing it now. The system had been built to function without depending on any particular person, and the person who built it had understood that when he built it, and had built it that way on purpose, and now the system would go on functioning without him. The rain came back harder past Lee Highway, the front having stalled before moving fully through, and she turned the wipers to interval 2 again and held 61. The 43 edge case categories were still in the monitor, all 43 still in the system. The physical archive correlation with its 847 boxes still in the room. The category tree still on the screen. The system would catch what it was built to catch. That was what it was. That was the whole shape of it. She drove.